the best in the world. I want to bring in my political panel, Liberal Senator Arthur Sinodinos, who of course was Chief of Staff to John Howard, and Labor Senator Louise Pratt. Welcome to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Patricia. Hi, Louise.
Arthur, I'll start with you. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is moving to tighten gun laws in New Zealand. What lessons can be learned from the Australian experience? Because they couldn't deliver the detail today, but there is a complex process to actually go through now, isn't there?
Well, there is. In our case, of course, you had to get the states and territories on board. New Zealand is a unitary state. It's a different kettle of fish in that sense. They should be able to move fairly quickly. The main pressure point, I suspect, will be on the National Party in New Zealand, because there will be potentially some farmers and other groups who may be concerned about tightening of laws or registration of firearms. We found here in Australia that there was not so much opposition from the public in the broad, but certainly within farming and regional areas there was concern about the impact of the legislation on people who were just going about their daily business, and that became a political issue that had to be managed. John Howard, who had no idea or much idea about firearms to begin with, had to learn very quickly a lot of the technicalities around firearms, things like crimping and what were the implications of the different types of firearms that could be banned and all the rest of it. So there was quite a process to go through with all of this. They should be able to move fairly quickly, but the important thing is to make sure they get some of the stakeholders who are big users of guns in New Zealand on side quickly, and I think they have to move very quickly to do that and use the impact of this horrific event to really ram home some world's best practice legislation like we have in Australia.
I want to talk about the debate that we're having post-Christchurch. If I can start with you on that issue, Louise. We've heard the Prime Minister's speech today. He's given a significant speech. He's criticised both the left and the right and talked about sort of this debate that we're seeing, which around extremism, that there are extremes on both sides. What do you make of the tone that the Prime Minister's taking here?
Well, I don't think that extremes belong in left or right politics. In a sense, it's about the extremist hatred and violence. They are not, should not and should never be ideological issues attached to how we manage the economy or how we treat people. What they are is hate speech and racist ideology. So I prefer, as Anne Alley highlighted, to say this is racist ideology and it should have no place in any version of politics in our country.
Arthur Sinodinos, has mainstream politics been too slow to respond to the rise in white supremacy in this country?
I have to admit that in the last year I've noticed particularly how quickly white supremacist views seem to have come to the fore. And I think what's been happening in Australia generally over the last few years is we seem to have become part of this international trend of identity politics, where so much store is put by someone's race, ethnicity or gender, potentially at the expense of the things we hold in common. Now, that's not an argument against inclusiveness and diversity. If anything, it's an argument for inclusiveness and diversity. But I've noticed that there are groups that are seeking to capitalise on any concerns there might be in the community about immigration or other things, but have sought to pervert those into this debate around racial pressures, invasion and all this other stuff that we're seeing now. And the important thing for all of us as mainstream politicians is now to stand together and to say, look, there's a tipping point here. We've reached a tipping point as a country. We are proud of being a multicultural country. We're proud of what we've done to bring people from all parts of the world. And the reason it's succeeded is because people are allowed to celebrate their heritage, no matter where they're from, while having an overarching loyalty to Australia and her institutions. And this is what we've got to stand up for. And we saw a great example of unity last year when we had the same-sex marriage debate finally come to fruition, where we brought a community that had been marginalised and victimised for a long time into the mainstream. This has got to be the great current of Australian life, how we keep bringing people in and making them part of the greater whole and making them feel part of what it means to be Australian.
Arthur Sinodinos, you at one point, I think I'm just going to try and get your direct language, One Nation is more sophisticated now when asked about a WA One Nation preference deal. Do you retract that statement now? Do you accept that One Nation isn't more sophisticated but is promoting white supremacist views?
No, I said that at the time because they were cooperating with us in the Senate in helping to pass our legislation. But the fact of the matter is, you'll find in those same comments, I repudiated what they had to say about immigration policy and the like. We believe in a global, non-discriminatory immigration policy, and we don't believe in vilifying part of the community. I don't want to give succor to One Nation. I reject their views. My job is to take people away from groups like them, make them part of the mainstream.
Louise Pratt, should the Senate look at potential powers to remove Fraser Anning? He doesn't seem particularly disturbed by a censure motion, you know, essentially very unfazed. Is that enough?
Well, it's very difficult to remove a senator from Parliament. It's very difficult to remove a senator from Parliament. You know, Senator Anning may have come pretty close to committing a criminal offence on the weekend, but that's for others. You know, for the courts and whether any charges are pressed to be decided. But 1 million people have signed a petition in support for his removal from Parliament. I think the key thing is, though, it wouldn't matter how seriously the Parliament wanted to take this issue. We're due to have an election very soon, and those wheels, I think, will turn much faster than the Parliament would be able to. And, you know, a censure motion, I'm very much looking forward to making sure that those views and that debate is had when Parliament returns, and I would call on One Nation to support that motion.
Arthur Sinodinos, back to you. Peter Dutton this morning made some comments which have been quite controversial, essentially, you know, creating a sense of equivalence or equal footing for the Greens versus Fraser Anning. Was that wrong? Do you think he should have steered away from that? I mean, is there really an equivalence between comments made by the Greens on the political left with Fraser Anning's comments in the wake of the Christchurch attacks?
Look, I think Fraser Anning, frankly, is in a class of his own with what he's done. I've never seen anything like this in the Australian Parliament. One Nation have come close, but this guy has just driven it to its irrational conclusion. That's what's made what he said stand out so much. In the case of Peter Dutton, he was reacting, I think, to the fact that he was being attacked by the Greens in relation to past comments he may have made. So there was a bit of a political tangle there, but the fact of the matter is there's political discourse and then there's this lunacy which now seeks to create a situation in which we are effectively saying 200 years of seeking to develop a multicultural society here somehow is a failure, even though every day on the streets of Australia we see multiculturalism at work, and we see the fact that people can get on with each other. We let each other get on with our lives, celebrate our faiths, our beliefs, our heritage, without having to worry about being attacked for where we came from.
Louise Pratt, does the tone of the coverage around Muslims and terrorism in sections of the media help to normalise these viewpoints? I know there's been a criticism, for instance, of Channel 7 having Pauline Hanson as a regular. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yes, when any minority group is singled out and exceptionalised in some way, it can exacerbate differences in the community. But what we're seeing now right across Australia is the real Australia. That's communities coming together in sorrow, coming together to support each other in their grief and their horror at what has happened. And that is an enormous uniting force for our nation. And that is what we need to celebrate in our community. We need more TV, we need more popular culture that shows how human we all are, rather than exacerbates our differences.
Arthur Sinodinos, have you noticed a rise in white supremacy in the mainstream dialogue and also, I suppose, a rise in an anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiment in this country?
Yeah, I have, and I mentioned before, we seem to be so focused on identity today, we're in danger of emphasising our differences rather than the things that unite us are greater than the things that divide us. And mainstream politicians, I think, have got to continue to emphasise that, because that is the truth about Australia. And you don't do it by just outright banning some groups. You use the full force of the law when people break the law. But if you force people to go underground, you make the situation worse. It's best to flush groups out and have a proper community debate where we stand for certain strong values which unite us as a country, and you'll find most Australians will respond to that, as Louise is suggesting.
So, Arthur Sinodinos, what do you make then of this debate we had just a couple of weeks ago, and I think we'll continue to have it, to be honest, that asylum seekers from offshore detention centres would take the spots of Australians in hospitals? Do you see that kind of rhetoric? And, you know, senior ministers in your government, Peter Dutton was one of them, talked about that as being part of this issue of talking in a language which creates a sense of anxiety in the community that's also dishonest. I mean, no Australians are going to lose their spot in a public hospital, are they?
I think as far as border protection is concerned, as long as we recognise this is a policy issue, it's not a political issue. Border protection, strong borders, helps to underpin, as I've said to you before, Patricia, having a generous immigration program and a strong refugee and humanitarian program. We need a situation where people have confidence that we have control of our borders, and that we can have that discussion separate from seeking to score points over who said what and who seeks to try and undermine whose credentials in this area. It's important for us to have that policy debate. It's something our fellow Australians expect.
But I do want clarity from you. You agree with me, don't you? No Australian's going to lose their access to a publicly funded hospital bed because of an asylum seeker from one of our offshore detention centres.
Well, I'd be surprised if that is the case, but again, I'm not privy to the information that maybe lay behind that statement. Well, I can only say to you that I think we need to take border control seriously and not say, oh, that's just a political issue, it's only being run for racial or other reasons. There are real policy reasons why we have to do this, and if we have a bipartisan consensus on that, it is better for the country in the long run. Look,
I'd be surprised too if that happened. I've recently been at a public hospital, and if you turn up and you're sick, you'll get treatment. That's the way this country works. Look, Louise Pratt, I want to return to you just on how we resolve these issues. Now, we're going into an election campaign. We know they can often be ugly and divisive. How do you think Labor, for instance, should handle this issue? Do you seek bipartisanship with Arthur's side of politics to take, I suppose, the really hyper-political element of this debate out of that political election prism?
It would be wonderful if we could do that. But the question that you just put to Arthur Sinodinos about hospitals and the idea that refugees might take places off Australians, the fact that our Prime Minister said that when it's patently untrue shows the kind of stuff that needs to be put to bed in this election. The Labor Party certainly won't be doing that, and I would be calling on the coalition to do the same, because when we don't have calm, rational debate based on the facts, then that is what feeds extremism in our community. So the Labor Party would love to be able to work with the coalition in a bipartisan way on these, but we need to see that also in their own actions.
So, Arthur, I'll just end with you. I've put that to Louise, this idea that, this issue being played out in an election campaign is obviously, well, potentially very dangerous in a country that is peaceful and seeks peace. I mean, all of us agree that we should be a multicultural country that's peaceful. Do you urge your colleagues to kind of steer away from hyper-politicised and divisive language on these issues?
Well, I think, as I said to you earlier, I think we've reached a tipping point, and New Zealand was that tipping point. And the remarks of the Prime Minister today about, putting an end to this tribalism, this endless tribalism that goes on, I think is a good marker of where we can go where we can go, and hopefully that means that this coming election campaign will be debated, discussed in that tone.
I want to thank both of you. A really interesting conversation and how civil conversations should be had. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
And that was Liberal Senator Arthur Sinodinos, who of course was a former minister in the Turnbull government before he took some time off. He was sick for a while. And also Labor frontbencher Louise Pratt. And interesting comments there from Arthur on gun reform too. He was of course Chief of Staff to John Howard, who embarked on those far-reaching gun reforms that really have changed Australia, Selena.